They laughed at the female SEAL sniper, until the enemy commander begged her for mercy. They said the desert had no echo, but the laughter carried anyway. It moved across the dunes like a low wind, cruel, endless, shaped by arrogance. The training yard of Forward Operating Base Kestrel shimmered under the sun, heat rising in ghostly columns. A dozen SEALs in sand-stained gear watched the newcomer adjust her rifle. She was small compared to them, shoulders narrow, hair cropped too close to soften her face. No insignia except the simple patch on her chest, a fox's eye, drawn in black. Someone chuckled behind her. Someone else whispered, "The brass must be desperate." The tone wasn't angry, just the kind of disbelief men reserve for the impossible. She didn't answer. She aligned the scope with the horizon and breathed once, shallow and quiet. Her heart slowed. Distance was her native language. It had raised her better than any city. The target was a steel plate 2 kilometers out, a test used only for show. The desert shimmer blurred everything beyond 1 mile. The officers didn't expect her to hit it. They expected her to hesitate. She didn't. The shot left no drama. It was sound stripped to its essence, a single punctuation in the paragraph of heat. The plate rang a second later, a dull bell announcing a new rule of gravity. Silence followed, thick, humid, disbelief wrapped inside it. Then, quietly, another shot. The same plate, same note, exactly 1 heartbeat later, 2 holes, 1 shadow. The laughter stopped. She lowered the rifle, emptied the chamber and stood. No triumph, no smirk, only stillness. The instructor approached, checked the target feed, said nothing. He looked at her name tag, Reyes, then at her eyes, unreadable behind the glass of her goggles. He wanted to ask where she'd learned to do that. He didn't. Some questions announced their own answers through fear. From that day, the jokes changed tone. Laughter turned into myth. She earned her call sign 3 weeks later in a valley no one returned from whole. The mission report called it a search and extract, but it was really a silence operation. The team moved through fog and stone under a moon that looked more like a wound than a light. They were pinned halfway through the canyon, bullets carving air into splinters. Radios failed, maps lied. Reyes lay in the dust, pulse calm, eyes steady through the scope. She saw movement, 6 silhouettes along the ridge, enemy marksmen with better angles. Her spotter shouted something she didn't hear. She fired once, adjusted, fired again, until the ridge went still. The silence that followed was total, heavy enough to erase her name. The team escaped. When they returned, her commanding officer asked how she'd tracked the 6th man when even satellite imaging had lost him. She answered, "I listened to the laughter." It confused him until he realized what she meant. The enemy had laughed when they thought the Americans were finished. She had triangulated the sound. Her bullet had spoken the reply. From then on, echo became her code. Years later, when the war forgot its reasons and kept only its routines, she operated without ceremony. She wore silence like a badge, distance like armor. The new recruits whispered that she could kill by memory. They said she didn't breathe, that wind obeyed her, that she counted heartbeats instead of seconds. She never corrected them. Myths, if useful, deserve survival. The only person who called her by name was the admiral who had once doubted her. He did so carefully, as if invoking a fragile truce. "Reyes," he would say, "what do you see when you look through that scope?" She always answered, "The end of noise." When the next mission arrived, it wasn't ordinary. The brief was coded black. No flag, no insignia, only coordinates and a voice file that trembled with fear. The target, a rogue commander known for broadcasting his captives' executions, live across enemy channels. He called himself the Minister of Echoes. He used sound as a weapon, pumping laughter and screams into radio frequencies to break morale. He was brilliant, cruel, theatrical. Command wanted him silenced, not killed, silenced. They sent the one person whose silence had already become legend. The night before insertion, Reyes cleaned her rifle by candlelight. The weapon was more than metal. It was a memory of every decision she had ever refused to regret. The scope gleamed faintly, catching the light of the flame. She thought of the laughter that had greeted her first shot, the disbelief that had followed, and the way silence had claimed both. At 0300, the chopper cut through the cold dark above a mountain range that looked like broken teeth. The pilot gave her a glance before lowering altitude. "You'll have one window, 3 minutes. After that, radio blackout." She nodded once. When the door opened, the wind entered like a voice calling its own name. She jumped. The parachute deployed high, a shadow unfolding against a field of smaller shadows. Below her, enemy floodlights scanned the valley like nervous eyes. She landed without sound, knees bending into gravel that whispered under her boots. The world smelled of oil and iron. For 6 hours, she crawled through dust and ruin, each movement deliberate enough to shame prayer. She counted the wind shifts, timed her breaths with the rotation of the searchlights. When she finally set the bipod down on a cracked wall, dawn had begun to dilute the horizon. Through her scope, she saw the compound, a fortress of speakers and antennas, walls painted with propaganda slogans in a language that had learned to lie beautifully. At the center, on a raised platform, a man in a black coat stood before a microphone, rehearsing the day's performance, the Minister of Echoes. He spoke to no one, yet every loudspeaker repeated his words. The sound reached her like heat, ugly, proud, amused. He laughed between sentences, enjoying his own echo. She centered the crosshair on his throat and hesitated. The brief said silence him, not kill him. But mercy wears many disguises. She adjusted the scope 1 click to the right, breathed in, and waited for the laugh to return. When it did, she fired. The bullet hit the microphone, severing its stem. The sound exploded into feedback, a shriek that folded the entire valley into stillness. The man fell backward, clutching his ears, mouth open but voiceless. The loudspeakers died one by one, leaving only the wind. Command would later call it a miracle of precision. She called it equilibrium. The operation ended with no casualties except pride. The footage circulated secretly among the enemy. For the first time, their commander had begged for mercy, not with words, but with silence. Back at the base, when she returned from debriefing, the younger soldiers looked at her differently. No laughter, no whispers, just that respectful quiet that people give to storms after surviving them. That night, she sat alone cleaning her rifle again, candlelight trembling over her hands. The metal was still warm from the shot that had changed a war's vocabulary. She looked through the empty scope and saw only her own reflection. Behind it, the candle flickered. For a moment, she imagined it was a sunrise and not a flame. In that moment, she realized something she never allowed herself to think. Silence was not the end of noise. It was what remained when courage learned to breathe alone. She blew out the candle and listened to the dark. And the dark, obedient as ever, listened back. The air in the barracks never truly slept. It vibrated with the echoes of drills, orders, and the quiet rhythm of bodies that had learned discipline as a second heartbeat. Reyes sat on her bunk, polishing the same rifle she had carried through half the world. Its metal smelled faintly of oil and of every dawn she had survived. The candle beside her burned low, small enough that the flame had to fight its own exhaustion. Around her, laughter from the younger recruits drifted through the thin walls. It wasn't mocking now. It was the nervous kind of laughter that soldiers use to keep the night from growing too large. Outside, the desert moved like a slow machine. Wind dragged dust against metal fences and whispered stories older than any uniform. Somewhere out in that expanse, the Minister of Echoes lay voiceless, his empire of noise undone by a single bullet. Command called the mission complete. The world, however, had not learned how to fill the silence left behind. The next assignment came wrapped in secrecy again, but this time, the courier who delivered the file avoided her eyes. He placed the envelope on her table and left without salute. Inside, there was no map, no photo, only a phrase typed in red. "They are learning to fear you. Someone intends to teach them how not to." She read it twice, then folded it into her pocket. Fear was a teacher she never trusted. It taught quickly and forgot slowly. 3 days later, she found herself in the highlands of a country that did not officially exist. Mist rolled across the cliffs like breath. Her team, 3 men, 1 woman, all veterans, moved through the ruins of an old fortress that had once served kings and now served no one. The mission was observation only. Verify intelligence that the enemy was building a training camp deep within the mountains. No shots, no noise. Reyes positioned herself on the highest ridge, scope resting against stone. Through it, she saw nothing but fog at first, then faint movement, figures practicing formation drills in the courtyard below. Their precision was mechanical, identical, unnerving. When the mist thinned, she saw the man leading them. Tall, thin, movements elegant, like someone who believed in art more than war. His voice carried even through the wind, calm, patient. The translator in her earpiece whispered his name, Commander Vosk, the strategist behind the new resistance, a scholar turned soldier. He spoke of philosophy between orders. He quoted poets while demonstrating the best way to dismantle a rifle. To him, killing was a conversation between disciplines. To his men, it was scripture. The others in Reyes's team watched with quiet contempt. "He trains killers like he's hosting a lecture," one whispered. She said nothing. Through her scope, she studied the way Vosk moved. Deliberate, unhurried, completely certain that the world would eventually understand him. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Authority, when genuine, travels without volume. She recognized the type. Men who mistook stillness for weakness, quiet for fear. When the team exfiltrated that night, something felt off. A flicker of light on the horizon, too rhythmic to be random. She turned her scope back toward the fortress and saw no sentries on the walls, only the flag moving wrong, against the wind. She realized it too late. The explosion hit half a second later. The ridge beneath them lifted, tore, and fell apart. Reyes woke under debris, ears filled with dust and memory. 2 of her team were gone instantly, another screaming into a broken radio. The trap had been perfect, waiting for observers. Vosk had known they would come. He had studied silence the way a surgeon studies a pulse. She crawled through rubble until she found the surviving soldier, blood seeping from his temple, eyes unfocused. He looked at her and tried to speak. She put a hand over his mouth and whispered something only he could hear. Then she carried him until the mist swallowed them both. For 3 days, they hid among rocks and ruins. Drones searched overhead, their hum constant and cruel. The wounded man drifted between fever and apology. Reyes rationed the silence as carefully as she rationed water. On the 4th day, she watched him stop breathing. She closed his eyes and left her rifle beside him, a marker, a promise. When she reached the extraction point alone, Command greeted her with the same questions they always asked. Coordinates, assessment, probability. She answered with a single sentence. We were the lesson, not the observers. The Admiral listened, face carved in discipline. "You're saying he set the trap for you personally?" She nodded. "For what I represent." He studied her expression. "And what do you represent, Reyes?" She didn't answer, because she knew the real answer frightened him more than any enemy. That night, she read the new reports. Vosk had taken over 3 border outposts in less than a week without firing a single shot. The defenders surrendered after hearing his broadcast. He had used the voice of one of their own commanders, perfectly imitated. The Admiralty declared him a threat to morale. They didn't understand that morale had already become his weapon. Reyes asked for permission to return to the mountains. Denied. "We don't negotiate with ghosts," the Admiral said. But ghosts, she thought, negotiate with everyone. She went anyway. No orders, no team. She followed the line of silence that stretched between her guilt and his laughter. Each night she camped higher up the ridge, listening to the wind. Once she thought she heard voices carried from the valley, soldiers laughing again, the same laughter that had once greeted her at her first range. It burned cold in her chest. At dawn on the 6th day, she found the remnants of the fortress. Smoke rose from the courtyard, straight and thin. Through her scope she saw Vosk again, standing where he always did, speaking to his new recruits. This time, though, he wasn't preaching. He was waiting. He turned his head slightly toward the ridge, almost smiling. She knew then he had heard her coming long before she'd arrived. He lifted a hand and gestured to the sky. Drones turned above him, obedient as hawks. A loudspeaker crackled. His voice reached her through the fog, magnified but strangely intimate. "You can't kill an echo, Sergeant Reyes," he said. "It already lives in the silence you worship." She didn't move. She knew the trick. Provoke emotion, break rhythm, win control. He was studying her, searching for fear in her breathing. She gave him none. For an hour they watched each other through the lens of distance, two disciples of the same doctrine. Precision. When the sun reached the midpoint of the valley, she finally spoke, not through radio or loudspeaker, but softly to herself. The wind carried it anyway. Echoes fade. Her finger rested on the trigger, not yet ready. Then she saw it. A group of prisoners lined along the wall, faces covered, hands bound. Among them, one wore an American patch. The missing officer from her team. Alive, barely. Vosk spoke again, calm as scripture. "Let's see how much silence can protect." He raised a pistol toward the prisoner. The shot that followed did not come from his hand. It came from hers. The bullet traveled through mist and time, through laughter and regret, through the long memory of every insult she had swallowed. It struck the weapon first, shattering it, then passed cleanly through his shoulder. He fell backward into dust, hand clutching disbelief. The drones hesitated, machines for the first time, learning confusion. Reyes whispered to the wind, "No mercy asked, no mercy given." The loudspeakers screamed static, then went dead. She left the ridge before dawn, moving through smoke and consequence. Behind her, the fortress burned without sound, the flames rising in reverence rather than rage. She didn't watch it fall. She had learned what fire already knew. Destruction is only another way of saying enough. By the time she reached the extraction point again, the world had changed its posture toward her. Her silence was no longer discipline, it was prophecy. Command called her in for questioning. She answered with composure, recounting facts stripped of heroism. When they asked why she hadn't killed Vosk, she said because he hadn't yet understood mercy. They dismissed her with medals she refused to wear. That night she sat alone on the roof of the barracks, rifle beside her, stars above. The desert below slept uneasily, the way truth sleeps after too much exposure. She looked at the horizon and thought she saw movement, a shadow limping across the sand, unarmed, unhurried. She didn't raise the rifle. Some targets are meant to live long enough to carry the burden of survival. She closed her eyes. The laughter that had once haunted her returned, softer now, turning into something like forgiveness. The war continued, but it sounded different. The world had started to listen. The desert changes color when it remembers. That was the first thing Reyes noticed as the morning bled into another missionless day. The sands outside the base looked less like dust and more like parchment, something written on and then erased too many times. She watched it from the roof, rifle across her knees, the air still carrying the faint scent of burnt stone from the fortress she'd left behind. The war had quieted in that region, but quiet didn't mean peace. It meant breath held between heartbeats. Inside her, the same stillness began to stretch into something unmanageable. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every time her eyes closed, sound came crawling in. The crack of a rifle, the echo of laughter that was no longer cruel, only human, followed by the hum of machinery searching for signals that no longer existed. Sometimes, in those half-dreams, she heard her own name spoken softly by a voice that could not have survived. The medics called it stress, command called it sensitivity, but she called it memory, trying to find a new shape. At 0400, a coded message arrived through the low-frequency band she wasn't supposed to monitor anymore. It was faint, distorted, a whisper under static, but unmistakable. 3 words. Sergeant Reyes. Listen. She froze. The voice was male, older, disciplined. She played it again. Sergeant Reyes. Listen. The cadence matched no one she knew alive. She checked the transmitter logs. No incoming signal, no encryption trail, nothing that could exist. The sound had come from inside the system, not through it. She remembered the phrase she'd spoken to herself in the mountains. Echoes fade. But echoes, it seemed, had learned to answer back. By dawn, she was back in the briefing room, staring at the wall map. Red lines crossed the continent, marking conflict zones like scars. The Admiral entered quietly, reading her face before speaking. "You're hearing it too, aren't you?" She turned to him slowly. "What do you mean?" He gestured toward the communications console. "Background transmissions, random, untraceable. They're spreading. It started 2 nights ago. Low decibel waves under normal traffic. Some of my men claim to hear voices when the machines idle." She said nothing, only nodded. He sighed. "They think it's the enemy testing new sonic weapons. I think it's something else. You were closest to the source, Reyes. You opened a door, and now something's walking through it." He handed her a recorder. "Find out what it wants." She took the device and left without a word. The corridors of the base hummed softly beneath the fluorescent lights, that same subtle vibration she had begun to feel under her skin. When she reached the observation deck, she turned the recorder on and stood in silence. The hum adjusted as though aware. Then faintly she heard it again. Her name, spoken clearly this time. "Reyes. You left one alive." She gripped the rail. The wind carried nothing but sand, yet the voice continued. "You left one alive, and the sound learned mercy." She closed her eyes, and for a moment she wasn't on the deck. She was back on the ridge, the mist parting around her like a curtain drawn by regret. She saw Vosk again, the scholar commander, his arm bleeding, his mouth moving, though no words came. She remembered not killing him. She remembered the mercy she'd told command about. She had thought mercy was the end of violence. Now it felt like the beginning of something else. The following night, more transmissions appeared. All bases along the border reported hearing the same phrase. "She listens, therefore she leads." It spread across frequencies, sometimes whispered by machines, sometimes repeated by wind sensors that had no speakers. The technicians tried to scrub it out. The phrase returned, softer, patient. Reyes realized the war had evolved beyond control. Silence had become contagious. She began to track the signals herself, triangulating them with the precision of a sniper. The coordinates led her toward the sea, a coastline abandoned since the first strikes of the conflict, a place where communication cables cut through cliffs and into the deep. She requisitioned a jeep, left the base without clearance, and drove for 2 days. The horizon ahead was endless blue-gray, the kind of distance that eats certainty for breakfast. At sunset of the 2nd day, she reached the coast. Waves struck the rocks in careful rhythm, as if counting something sacred. She set up the recorder again. Static filled the air. Then, beneath it, the voice spoke once more. "Do you remember the sound you made the day the laughter stopped?" She didn't answer. The wind did. That sound changed everything. It taught machines patience. It taught men how to breathe before commanding. You built a new silence, but silence is not peace if it has no listener. She understood now. The voice wasn't haunting her. It was calling her to maintain the balance she had accidentally created. That night she camped on the shore, unable to sleep. Dreams came, soft and cruel. She saw Vosk again, not wounded this time, but standing beside her, looking out at the sea. He spoke without lips moving. "Do you think mercy spares only others?" When she woke, dawn light had painted the water gold. Her rifle lay beside her, dew forming on its barrel. The recorder blinked with a new message. She pressed play. It wasn't Vosk this time. It was her own voice, recorded in perfect clarity, though she had never spoken the words aloud. "You are the weapon that chose not to fire. The world has been listening since." She looked out at the waves and realized something both terrifying and comforting. Her silence had become its own frequency, echoing through everything capable of vibration: steel, water, heartbeats. The sound remembered her name because it had grown from it. By the time she returned to base, the world had changed tone. News broadcasts began reporting unexplained moments of quiet. Crowds falling silent for no reason, birds stopping mid-flight, power stations pausing as if thinking. The Admiralty feared global interference. Reyes knew better. The world was calibrating itself to a new moral rhythm. In the command center, she found the Admiral staring at a dead monitor. He looked up. "They're calling it the stillness effect. We've lost our satellites for 13 minutes straight." 13 minutes, she repeated. He nodded. Then everything came back, cleaner, no interference, no propaganda lines, just order. She placed her rifle on the table. "It's learning restraint." He frowned. "It?" "The sound." He didn't laugh. No one did anymore. In the weeks that followed, the voice returned less often, but its influence deepened. Machinery worked quieter, orders grew shorter, soldiers stopped shouting in drills. Laughter returned, softer, genuine. The base had rediscovered calm, not through command, but through echo. Then one morning, as the sun rose like an old promise, a final transmission came through. 3 words again, the same tone, familiar now. "Stand down, Reyes." She froze. The Admiral had not authorized any signal. She traced it. It came from nowhere, everywhere. "Stand down, Reyes." She stepped outside. The desert wind moved in slow currents, carrying dust like whispered confessions. She closed her eyes and listened one last time. The voice continued, steady. "The war has remembered you. That is enough." The radio fell silent, and for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe without listening for the next sound. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with everything she had ever refused to forget. The desert never truly ended. It only changed moods. Sometimes it glittered like armor. Sometimes it sulked beneath its own heat. When the stillness effect spread across the networked world, this stretch of sand became its heart. The base at Kestrel was no longer a fortress. It was a lung. The soldiers moved through its corridors like air, entering, leaving, returning. Every wall hummed with the low rhythm of machinery that had learned humility. Reyes woke each morning to the same faint pressure in her chest, the body's reminder that it was part of a larger breathing. She no longer counted missions or days. Command still sent reports, but they read more like weather forecasts than war directives. She read them out of courtesy, then went outside to listen. The dunes had developed voices of their own. Not literal sound, but subtle shifts, a vibration when the wind touched them, a soft sigh when footsteps passed. She had begun to hear meaning in those movements, as if the ground were acknowledging her. The scientists who came to study the anomaly took samples, scanned frequencies, and left with data that proved nothing. She stayed and understood everything without proof. At night, she sat near the communications mast, the rifle across her knees like an old dog that no longer needed to bite. The stars above were clean again. The satellites no longer flickered with tension. The ocean's silence had reached even here, far inland, as if the world itself was synchronizing. It should have been peace. Yet peace carries its own kind of tremor, the anxiety of waiting for what you've trained your whole life to resist. The younger recruits grew restless. They practiced routines that had no enemy, drilled against phantom opponents drawn from memory. Some began to ask what a soldier becomes when there is no one left to fight. Reyes had no answer, only a story. She told them about her first day on the range, the laughter, the shot, the ring of steel in hot air. How silence had taught her more than any command ever did. She told them that obedience without listening is just noise. They listened the way parched earth listens to rain. One evening, an old transmission officer brought her a strange recording. "It's repeating through the auxiliary channel," he said. "Might be feedback, but it sounds intentional." She played it, a whisper beneath static, familiar cadence. The desert remembers what the sea forgets. Her pulse slowed. She walked out into the night with the recorder still running. The sand accepted her weight without protest. She answered aloud, "And what do you remember of me?" No reply, only wind, curling like thought. She set the recorder down and left it there overnight. By dawn, the machine had filled itself with a pattern of clicks and pauses that, when slowed down, formed a message. Coordinates. Her own. The desert was calling her inward. She followed. For 2 days, she walked alone, carrying only water, the rifle, and the small recorder. The dunes rose higher, shaped by winds older than history. On the 3rd day, she reached a plateau of black stone, scorched smooth by lightning. In its center lay a single steel casing half buried in sand. It was hers, the round she had fired years earlier, the one that ended laughter and began everything else. She picked it up. The metal was warm, though no sun touched it. Inside the hollow, she heard faint resonance, like a heartbeat trapped in shell. She held it to her ear and listened. "Mercy remembers," it said. The words were her own, or perhaps the world's repetition of them. She placed the casing back into the earth, covered it and whispered, "Then learn to forgive." The ground settled as if exhaling. When she returned to Kestrel, the air in the base had changed again. The generators ran quieter, the personnel spoke less. The Admiral met her on the landing pad. His uniform looked more ceremonial than functional, the gold trim dulled by dust. "There's unrest in the cities," he said. "People have stopped broadcasting. Governments are frightened of the silence they created. They want us to resume operations, something visible, something loud." Reyes studied him. "You want to restart the noise." He didn't deny it. "They think if we act normal, the world will follow." She looked toward the horizon, where the dunes rolled like slow waves. Normal was the problem. He nodded but said nothing. They gathered at first by accident, or that was how it looked on paper. A mechanic who had stopped shouting at turbines and noticed they ran cooler. A medic who listened to a patient's breathing until the monitor followed suit. Two new operators who had never met Night Fox yet stood with their hands resting on the comms console like people greeting a familiar animal. None of them asked Reyes to lead them. They simply arrived at the range at dawn and waited while the light lifted the desert a shade at a time. She pretended not to notice. Pretending protected them from the bureaucracy, still deciding whether she was an asset or a warning. When they returned the second morning and the third, she placed her rifle on the bench and said today there would be no ammunition. They would learn to aim without firing, to breathe until distance confessed its shape. The first lesson was listening to the target. The recruits squinted at the steel plates set out across the flats and laughed under their breath. "Targets do not speak," one of them muttered. Reyes told them to close their eyes and name the wind not by speed, but by story. The operator with nervous hands said the wind smelled of copper. The mechanic said it carried heat from the east like a tired horse. The medic said it sounded like a person leaving a room and deciding halfway to stay. Only when the air had been named did Reyes let them open their eyes again. They discovered the steel had changed color a fraction, a blush of light moving across its surface as if it had listened back. She taught them to count silence instead of seconds. A breath in to learn what the body wants, a breath out to teach it what it needs. She walked behind them barefoot, letting the sand tell her which of them tried too hard. Trying too hard was noise. Noise made shots hurry. She had learned long ago that a hurried bullet rarely understood mercy. When they finally loaded live rounds, she gave them a single rule. If you cannot hear the place your shot will leave behind, you are not permitted to take it. The youngest recruit frowned and said he did not understand. She told him to point his barrel toward the farthest plate, then to imagine the ring that would rise from it if he hit. "Who does that ring summon?" she asked. "Who hears it as relief, who as grief?" Until the answer is human, the trigger stays a promise rather than a sentence. News of the training spread the way useful rumors spread, quietly and inevitably. Not a school, not a unit, only a practice. They came between shifts and after patrols, some with weapons, some with hands empty on purpose. A drone pilot asked if listening mattered from 1,000 meters up. Reyes placed her palm on the drone's rough wing and told her to make a loop without orders and return when the air felt like a yes. The pilot returned with a small smile and did not explain why. A demolition specialist brought charges that could shatter the cliff to demonstrate skill. She made him listen to the rock for an hour and then asked what the rock wanted. He set the charges in a figure that looked like a door, and when they blew, the dust rose in a rectangle and settled gently as if grateful to be rearranged rather than erased. Command tried not to care and failed. Some officers visited the range and stood with arms crossed, counting violations that did not exist in any manual. They left with nothing except the discomfort of recognizing a discipline they had not issued. One of them returned at night without his rank and asked Reyes whether a doctrine that begins with listening can ever end with force. She told him force is a verb that forgets its own subject. If you listen long enough, subjects return to their names. He went away with fewer decorations and more sleep. The desert took to the lessons like a horse that finally meets a rider who understands rains as conversation. The wind paused more often. The range birds nested closer to the berms. On mornings when the fog sat low and the targets wore halos of dew, the plates rang with a tone that felt less like metal than like the beginning of a song. Reyes built drills around these changes. She placed the students in a loose circle and told them to aim at opposite horizons, to breathe until the circle felt whole. A circle that cannot listen breaks at the first noise, she said. A circle that listens can hold a storm. The second lesson was restraint as accuracy. They learned to call off a shot at mid-trigger without shame. The medic was best at this, perhaps because she already knew that not every wound demands intervention. The mechanic learned to unscrew a stubborn bolt by leaving it alone for a minute and then returning with kinder torque. The operators discovered that targets could be persuaded rather than subdued. Reyes spun these small revelations into repetitions until the repetitions became posture. Precision, she told them, is not sharpness. It is mercy practiced at the level of muscle. The first tremor came at dawn, so slight that most mistook it for heartbeat or hunger. The sand shifted in a single long breath and settled again. The recruits on perimeter duty froze, not from fear but from recognition. They had been trained to feel difference through soles and ribs. Reyes felt it too, from the roof where she kept vigil over the base's sleeping hum. The tremor had direction. She could almost hear its geometry. Reports arrived by noon, low-frequency surges across the continent, harmless to machines, irresistible to human attention. People stopped mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-war. Then the tone faded, leaving clarity behind, a silence so wide it frightened those who had never met it before. Reyes gathered her students in the range's shadow. "What you felt," she said, "was the desert remembering its promise. It wants to know if we're keeping ours." They nodded, uncertain whether she was speaking of geology or conscience. She didn't clarify. Some lessons bloom only in vagueness. She sent small groups out in every direction, not as scouts, but as listeners. They walked unarmed, carrying instruments built from memory, tuning rods carved from the old rifle barrels, sensors that hummed softly when pointed toward empathy. They were to map the frequency not by coordinates, but by kindness. Where it lingered longest, people were still capable of listening. 2 days later, a young recruit returned from the northern villages with eyes full of reverence. "The children are playing games without winners," he said. "They don't know who taught them, but the rules match yours." Reyes smiled faintly. "Then, the doctrine is traveling faster than bullets ever did." The next morning, a convoy appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind it like an apology, trucks painted in neutral colors, no insignia. When they stopped outside Kestrel, a woman stepped out dressed in the beige of bureaucracy, her eyes ringed with sleepless calculation. She introduced herself as Liaison Commander Hart, the kind of title that implied control over things no one could command. "Headquarters wants to understand what you've built," she said. Reyes offered her water and silence. The woman took both, uncomfortably. "They think the stillness effect is spreading uncontrollably. Entire cities are quiet for hours. Commerce pauses, negotiations halt. We need containment." Reyes tilted her head. "Containment of what? Thought?" "Of influence," Hart said. "Whatever you started is rewriting obedience." "That was always the plan," Reyes murmured. They walked through the training grounds together. Hart watched the recruits moving like dancers, rifles slung without tension, every gesture rehearsed into reverence. "They're dangerous," Hart said softly. "Not because they fight, but because they don't need to." Reyes stopped. "Then maybe the danger was never them." That evening, as the liaison prepared her report, the frequency returned. Stronger, more deliberate. It pulsed through the base's foundations, through lungs and teeth, through every object capable of remembering vibration. The lamps flickered in time with it. Hart covered her ears and shouted, "What is this?" Reyes closed her eyes. "It's the world speaking without permission." When the tone faded, every monitor in the command post displayed the same message. Frequency stabilized, awaiting listener. Reyes stepped forward and placed her palm on the console. The lights dimmed to match her heartbeat. The system recognized her signature. Though no biometric data had ever been entered, a voice emerged, neither male nor female, neither machine nor human, calm as the first dawn. You taught silence to aim. Now it seeks alignment. Hart backed away. You're communicating with it? Reyes didn't answer. The voice continued. Noise divided the world. Balance requires resonance. Will you guide it? For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, guidance without control. Agreed, the voice said. Prepare the listeners. The light steadied. The message vanished. The bass's hum returned to its ordinary, fragile rhythm. After the event, Hart left hurriedly, muttering about containment protocols and spiritual contagion. She didn't look back. Reyes returned to her students, who were already waiting at the range, faces lit by understanding they could not name. The horizon just asked for direction, she told them. We'll answer by breathing. They stood in a line as the sun fell. The air shimmered with invisible chords. Reyes raised her hand and felt the weight of soundless expectation settle across the dunes. Somewhere beneath the earth, frequencies aligned like soldiers waiting for orders that would never come. Night deepened, but the desert glowed faintly, grains reflecting starlight in organized patterns. When the first wind rose, it carried a note low enough to shake bone, pure enough to cleanse regret. One by one, the recruits echoed it with their own breath. Together they formed a choir without melody, a weapon that aimed only at imbalance. The tone spread outward, crossing borders, seas, and static, until cities paused again. Not from confusion this time, but from comprehension. By dawn, the reports began. Ceasefires holding longer than expected, riots dissolving into stillness, negotiations resumed without translators. No one credited Kestrel. No one needed to. Reyes walked alone to the ridge and watched the horizon pulse like a living vein. She remembered the first laugh that had challenged her, the shot that had rewritten it, the mercy that had grown wild. Now the world breathed with her cadence. For the first time, she wondered if that was too much power for any single heart to anchor. She pressed her hand to the earth. If you must forget me, she whispered, do it kindly. The wind replied in her own voice, always. Behind her, the recruits stood in silence, their rifles resting like shepherd's staffs, eyes open not for enemies, but for balance breaking. She turned, nodded once, and smiled the kind of smile that ends wars quietly. Somewhere deep beneath Kestrel, the frequency hummed, patient, infinite, alive. It had found its listener. And in that moment, the desert exhaled. Morning broke without ceremony. The horizon simply exhaled light, and the dunes accepted it with the grace of disciples who no longer needed miracles. Kestrel Base had become something between a monastery and a myth. Its silence studied, its routines whispered about in distant headquarters. The younger soldiers from other outposts arrived unannounced, as if drawn by gravity rather than command. They didn't salute when they met Reyes. They simply waited for her to breathe and then matched the rhythm. There was no longer a flag. The old one had been folded and buried beneath the shooting range. Its cloth returned to the earth as a symbol of noise surrendered. No anthem played at dawn, yet the air itself carried a quiet music. When the sun touched the steel targets, they rang softly, as though tuned by the wind. Reyes had stopped counting recruits. Numbers belonged to the old world. Now they measured presence by resonance. If the range hummed gently by sunrise, everyone was alive, aligned, listening. She stood at the ridge again, her silhouette long against the gold dust. In her hand she held the small casing she once buried, the echo of the shot that had begun her legend. The metal was cool now, worn smooth by years of confession. She raised it to her ear, expecting silence. Instead, she heard a heartbeat, steady, calm, not her own. "The desert's awake," she whispered. And it was. From the horizon came a slow vibration, not the violent tremor of war, but the deep bass of a world adjusting its spine. It rolled through the sands and into the bones of the base. Windows hummed, water rippled inside canteens. The frequency was familiar, the same pulse that had once asked her to guide it. Only now, it no longer waited for orders. It had learned independence. The recruits gathered instinctively. Some dropped to one knee, some stood still with eyes closed. None were afraid. Reyes turned toward them. "You hear it?" One of them nodded. "It's asking if we're ready." "For what?" No one answered. The question was its own completion. She walked to the communication tower, the same one that once carried the Admiral's orders, the same one that had nearly launched the missiles she'd stopped. It was silent now, but its steel vibrated faintly under her touch, like a sleeping animal dreaming of purpose. The frequency rose, low notes merged into patterns, and patterns began forming meaning. The air filled with something too precise to be mere sound. It was language stripped of words, intent transmitted directly through vibration. Reyes listened until she understood. The world wasn't speaking to her. It was speaking through her. Her knees felt weak. The message wasn't an order, it was an invitation. The stillness effect had reached its next stage. Silence no longer needed guardians. It had become self-sustaining, feeding on balance instead of command. She smiled faintly. "Then my part is done." But the horizon disagreed. The tone deepened, sharper now, a question encoded in sound. "Will you leave before the echo learns to fade?" Her breath caught. The air was filled with vibrations, forming something like memory. Images appeared behind her eyes, moments she thought forgotten. The first laugh that mocked her, the first shot that answered it, the mercy that rewrote war. Faces emerged from dust, those she'd saved, those she couldn't. She saw Vosk again, the man who had once called her an echo chaser, the one she'd spared. In the vision, he stood in a quiet city, surrounded by civilians who moved gently, speaking softly. He was older, slower, no longer wearing a weapon. His voice was calm. "You were right," he said to no one. "Noise ends faster than truth." The vision faded with the wind. When she opened her eyes, the recruits were still watching her. "Ma'am," one asked, "what happens now?" Reyes looked at them, not as soldiers, not as students, but as inheritors. "Now," she said, "the world breathes without supervision." She began dismantling her rifle. The gesture shocked them at first. The sacred object, the legendary tool, broken down piece by piece. She laid the barrel beside the casing, the scope beside her palm. "Every weapon," she said, "is just a question looking for its last listener. When the question is answered, the weapon retires." They watched in silence. No one moved to help. When she was done, the desert wind lifted a handful of sand and placed it gently over the metal, as if officiating a burial. That night, under a half moon, the base gathered for the final lesson. No words, no formation, just presence. Reyes stood before them one last time. "Once," she said, "I thought silence was what came after the shot. Later I learned it comes before. Now I know it's what remains when neither is necessary." She turned toward the horizon, where the frequency shimmered faintly in the air like heat. "If it ever rises again, don't command it. Don't worship it, just listen. It knows what to do." One of the younger soldiers stepped forward, hesitant. "Will we see you again?" Reyes smiled the same small, precise smile she'd worn the day she ended the Minister of Echoes. "You already do," she said, "every time you pause before speaking." Then she began to walk into the dunes. No one followed. No one needed to. The desert accepted her without ceremony, her outline dissolving into gold dust and wind. The recruits stood still for hours, unsure whether they were mourning or learning. When the sun rose again, Kestrel Base was quiet. The targets glowed faintly, the same faint hum resonating from the buried rifle parts. Birds nested on the communication tower. The briefcase the envoy had left months ago had rusted shut, unread. And in the silence, the frequency pulsed one final time, soft, patient, eternal. It spoke in a voice that was both desert and dawn. The command was never to fight. The command was to listen. The air trembled once, then stilled completely. Somewhere beneath the sand, where sound becomes memory and memory becomes law, the casing that began it all hummed gently like a heartbeat learning to rest. The desert had learned to breathe, and finally, so had humanity. They called it Meridian City again, though no compass could agree on where it truly stood. For decades, its skyline had screamed, steel needles piercing light, horns and turbines layered into an anthem of industry. But on the morning the desert exhaled, every motor coughed once and fell quiet. Elevators stopped mid-rise, traffic froze mid-gesture, and 1,000,000 conversations ended on the same unfinished word. People looked around and saw one another as if waking from a shared concussion. Then, slowly, they began to listen. From the hills beyond the suburbs, a faint vibration arrived, low, steady, familiar to those who once wore insignia from Kestrel. The stillness effect had traveled with the dust, carried by old supply convoys and forgotten radio towers. It didn't conquer, it suggested. The city obeyed not out of fear, but relief. Inside the central communication spire, an engineer named Mara Leon watched her monitors flatten into perfect, quiet lines. She had grown up on stories about a sniper who ended wars with silence, the woman called Night Fox, the echo listener of the dunes. Those tales had always sounded like myth, the kind of legend you tell children so they stop shouting indoors. Yet as she pressed her palm against the console, the metal warmed under her skin, pulsing in a rhythm that felt like breath. Messages appeared across dormant networks. They contained no orders, no propaganda, only coordinates and a phrase: "If you can hear this, wait before speaking." By noon, half the city had done exactly that. Factories discovered that their machines ran smoother after a minute of stillness. Trains synchronized schedules without central command. Surgeons reported steadier hands. Even markets calmed, the feverish pulse of buying and selling replaced by deliberate exchange. It was not peace, as politicians described it. It was efficiency baptized by empathy. The government responded the only way institutions know how, with a committee. A dozen ministers gathered in the marble echo chamber once built to prove power through acoustics. They debated what to call the phenomenon: interference, psychological contagion, acoustic terrorism. None fit. The microphones refused to work. Each time a minister raised his voice, feedback shrieked until he stopped. Finally, an aide whispered the only word that carried without pain: reverence. That afternoon, Mara Lian left her post and followed the pulse to the river that once powered the city. The water moved slower now, clear enough to reflect buildings, as if they were remembering their first drafts. Children stood along the bank, skipping stones in rhythm, each splash identical in distance and tone. They weren't competing, they were keeping time. An old man approached her, a retired soldier with weathered wrists and eyes like tempered glass. Without introduction, he said, "She passed this way, you know." Who? The one who taught bullets to breathe. Mara Lian stared across the river. "She's dead." He shook his head. Not dead, diffused. The desert couldn't keep her whole, so it turned her into frequency. You can hear her if you stand very still. He placed a small brass casing in her hand, the same shape, the same warmth Reyes had once felt. "This one came up in the irrigation line this morning. The engineers think it's debris. I think it's a reminder." Mara Lian pressed it to her ear. A faint hum answered, not mechanical but intimate, like someone inhaling before wisdom. That evening, the sky bruised violet and gold. From every balcony came the sound of chairs being moved gently aside, of people stepping out to meet the wind. They didn't speak. Some closed their eyes. Others tapped fingers on railings, matching the invisible beat. Across the planet, sensors registered a global resonance, one single, unbroken note, oscillating between 7 and 8 hertz, the range of calm awareness in the human brain. Hospitals reported a drop in cardiac arrests. Prison fights ceased mid-motion. Borders experienced a temporary blindness. Sentries forgot which side they stood on. In the shadow of Meridian's tallest tower, a group of children gathered around Mara Lian as she set the brass casing on the pavement. "What is it?" one asked. "History learning its inside voice." They laughed softly, the pure kind of laughter that doesn't bruise the air. It was the first sound the city allowed itself all day, and it echoed beautifully. Night came without electricity. The grid had shut itself down, conserving energy as if honoring a Sabbath. Yet the darkness wasn't frightening. The moonlight revealed faces instead of silhouettes. Neighbors who had never spoken shared water, shared stories, shared silence. In the early hours before dawn, Mara Lian felt the vibration rise again. Not through machines this time, but through the ground beneath her feet. She followed it to the plaza where the first foundation stone of the city had been laid a century ago. Dust circled it in slow spirals, forming shapes that looked like script but vanished before she could read them. Then a voice, unmistakably human, spoke from nowhere. "You're listening correctly." She turned, heart thudding. "Reyes." The wind carried the reply. Names were temporary. The frequency endures. Mara Lian dropped to her knees. "What do we do?" "Do nothing. Continue breathing where the world forgot to." The dust stilled. The hum receded until only the river's slow applause remained. When morning came, the city resumed, not as before, but lighter, deliberate. The council declared a national moment of quiet every sunrise. Schools replaced pledges with breathing exercises. Police laid down batons once per hour to feel their pulse sync with the pavement. And in every home, people began a new custom, placing a small cup of water on their windowsill each night. If ripples appeared by dawn, they said a prayer not of words, but of gratitude, for it meant the world had listened again. Weeks passed. The markets found balance, the hospitals healed without rush. Even the storms adjusted their cadence to avoid panic. The frequency had become the planet's conscience, gentle, persistent, incorruptible. One morning, as the sun rose amber over the quiet skyline, Mara Lian stood on the same balcony where she had once monitored chaos. She whispered into the air, "Is this how wars end?" Far away, across dunes no map could claim, the desert answered with the faintest vibration. "No," it said, "this is how humanity begins to hear itself." And the city, newly fluent in silence, kept listening. The resonance never stopped. It only learned humility. It spread like mist across continents, carried by pulse and prayer until the entire planet moved in a rhythm that required no conductor. Somewhere, deep beneath oceans and deserts, frequencies braided into a single heartbeat. And for the first time in recorded history, the world exhaled without flinching. In Meridian City, the silence had become its own infrastructure. Traffic flowed without lights, guided by instinct more than law. The markets opened at dawn, not because clocks demanded it, but because sunlight felt like permission. People spoke less, but when they did, words carried weight. Each syllable, a deliberate act of creation. Schools taught listening as literacy. Soldiers trained in stillness, priests prayed with their eyes open, and every night at the same hour a faint hum rose from the ground, so low it could have been mistaken for the earth stretching. No one feared it anymore. They called it the night fox's breath. Children said it kept the stars from falling. Adults nodded, half believing, half grateful for something larger than logic. Mara Lian had become the city's quiet historian. She recorded everything: the hour the grid first chose silence over power, the day traffic learned patience, the week laughter returned without mockery. Her journals contained no ink, only fingerprints pressed into soft pages of sand-cured paper. She said the dunes themselves deserved the final say. But even she could not ignore what began to happen in the 7th month of the stillness. The hum grew warmer. Machines started responding to it as if recognizing a mother's voice. Doors opened a heartbeat before someone reached for the handle. Lights flickered in rhythm with emotions, not voltage. The world, it seemed, had begun to remember who had taught it to listen. One night, as the moon hung low over the river, Mara felt a vibration through the brass casing she still kept by her bed. She lifted it to her ear. This time, it wasn't just hum. It was a voice, soft, familiar. "Do you still write?" Her breath caught. "You're alive?" "Alive is a smaller word than what I became," the voice said. "I stayed because someone must hold the quiet when humanity grows loud again." "Reyes," Mara whispered, "the world misses you. Then it has learned nostalgia." "That's good. It means it's human again." The voice paused, and Mara could almost feel the air smile. "Tell them not to worship silence. It was never meant to rule, only to remind." Then the casing cooled, the hum fading to a calm heartbeat. The next day, Mara gathered her students, the new generation of listeners who studied beneath the glass dome overlooking the city. "She's still here," she said simply, "not as a ghost, not as a god, as frequency." One of them, a child no older than 10, asked, "Can we talk to her?" Mara nodded toward the horizon. "Only if you ask without words." That night, the children climbed to the highest balcony and lay on their backs, staring at the stars. One by one, they placed their palms against the cold stone and breathed in rhythm, just as the manuals from Kestrel once instructed. The air thickened, the temperature dropped. Then came a whisper through the wind, not loud, not clear, but unmistakably human. "Well done," it said. "Now listen closer." They did. For hours the city slept while its children conversed with a ghost made of resonance. They asked no questions, only offered memories of laughter that didn't wound, of arguments that ended with understanding, of streets that forgot fear. The wind gathered their stories and carried them west, toward the dunes where everything had begun. In the desert, the sand stirred. It moved in patterns invisible to most, spiraling around a hollow spot where a single rifle barrel once lay buried. The hum returned, steady and proud. Out of that movement rose a figure, half light, half dust, the shape of a woman whose face the world already knew. She wasn't resurrected, she was remembered perfectly. She walked across the dunes barefoot, her steps leaving no mark. The air shimmered with each movement, translating vibration into warmth. She paused at the edge of what was once Kestrel Base. The structures had dissolved into dunes long ago, reclaimed by weather and mercy. All that remained was the faint impression of order, the outlines of walls, the suggestion of a tower, the ghost of command. Reyes, if that word still applied, knelt and placed her palm on the sand. "You learned faster than I expected," she whispered, though there was no one to hear. The ground pulsed gently under her touch, acknowledging the compliment. She stayed there through the night, her form flickering between presence and possibility. When dawn came, she turned toward the horizon, where the sun rose like a quiet applause. "They won't always remember," she said, "but the silence will." Then she dissolved completely, her particles rising into the air and scattering with the wind. Each grain carried a note, each note a lesson. By the time the breeze reached Meridian, the city's river sang faintly as it flowed, an unbroken hum like the echo of a promise kept. Mara Leon woke just before sunrise, sensing the change. She rushed to the balcony. The air shimmered gold for one heartbeat, then cleared. The brass casing beside her cracked gently, splitting open along a line of light. Inside lay a fragment of black sand, cool, weightless, ancient. She touched it and a final whisper filled her mind. Silence doesn't end when it's broken, it only begins to listen back. Tears blurred her vision. She placed the fragment in a bowl of water and set it on the window, letting dawn do the rest. When the first rays of sun touched it, the water rippled 3 times, slow, deliberate, eternal. And somewhere in the quiet beyond definition, the echo that chose to stay listened too. At first, the scientists thought it was coincidence. Seismic sensors around the world pulsing in synchrony with human heartbeat patterns. Every 33 seconds, a soft tremor hummed through the crust, too gentle to cause damage, too regular to dismiss as random. Then microphones placed in volcanic vents began transmitting tones that matched the frequency once traced to the deserts of Kestrel. It wasn't thunder, not tectonic restlessness, it was phrasing. The Earth was rehearsing language. In Meridian City, the phenomenon became impossible to ignore. Glass vibrated without cracking, water shivered in cups, metal fences sang like tuned strings. People paused mid-errand, knowing instinctively that this was not danger but dialogue. The world beneath their feet had found breath. Mara Liane, now older and quieter, walked to the river as she did every dawn. The hum met her there, rising through the soles of her shoes. She knelt and pressed her palm to the damp soil. It felt like a pulse, slow, vast, considerate. A voice formed, not in her ears, but in the hollow behind her ribs. "We listened to you listening," it said. "Now we remember how." She closed her eyes, letting the vibration fill her lungs until it became indistinguishable from her own heartbeat. "Then we're speaking the same language," she whispered. "Not yet," the earth replied. "You pause between words. We live in the pause itself." All across the continents, the same message unfolded in different tongues. Farmers heard it in the rhythm of irrigation pumps. Miners heard it through shafts that sighed before collapse. Sailors felt it in the calm that came before wind. The planet wasn't speaking sentences, it was returning awareness, a communion of pressure and patience. Governments tried to name it. Resonant feedback event, geopsychic alignment, the stillness pulse. But ordinary people called it simpler things, the breath, the listening, the moment. It became custom to stop whatever one was doing when the 30th second approached, to hold breath and feel the tiny tremor that reminded everyone of scale. Children learned to count not by numbers, but by vibrations. One hum, two hushes, three heartbeats. Mara began collecting the testimonies. In the mountains of the north, shepherds claimed the soil beneath the grass warmed just before the flocks turned home. In the coastal towns, waves broke in sequences that mirrored lullabies. A pilot flying over the Pacific said that his instruments glowed briefly, with patterns identical to a stethoscope reading. The echo of Reyes had not vanished. It had become substrate. Her silence had soaked so deeply into the world that even stone remembered it. When magma moved under the crust, it did so with rhythm. When lightning struck, it avoided water. When wind crossed the ruins of old battlefields, it slowed, as if apologizing. One evening, a signal reached Mara's observatory from a deep-sea probe. The data showed pulses coming from miles below the ocean floor, forming clear harmonic intervals. A chord that shifted with the moon. She listened through the speakers, tears forming as she recognized the pattern, the same three frequencies that once marked the night fox's breath. The planet was reciting her memory, wordless but perfect. At midnight, she broadcast a reply. No words, only breath. She stood before the microphone and exhaled gently into it. The tone traveled outward, through cables, through satellites, through the molten veins beneath continents. When it reached the farthest edges, the ground answered back. A tremor, light as mercy. The next morning, reports came in from every region. Forests blooming out of season, rivers clearing, birds returning to cities once too loud to host them. The earth had interpreted her exhale as invitation, and responded with equilibrium. It had remembered how to heal. For weeks the resonance deepened. Every pulse brought adjustment. Old sinkholes sealed, glaciers paused their retreat, coral began to hum faintly at dawn. Humanity realized that listening was not surrender, it was maintenance. The act of hearing the planet had become its heartbeat therapy. Still, not everyone found comfort in a world that required quiet. In the ruins of former capitals, remnants of the old noise gathered. Executives, generals, broadcasters who missed command. They built towers lined with amplifiers, hoping to drown the hum and reclaim authority. Their machines screamed for days until the foundations cracked. The earth did not retaliate, it simply absorbed the vibration, returned it softened, patient, unstoppable. The towers collapsed gently, like sandcastles conceding to tide. In the silence that followed, no one celebrated. They simply bowed their heads. That night, Mara stood on her balcony. The city beneath her glowed like a constellation breathing through concrete. She thought of Reyes, the soldier, the sniper, the listener. Somewhere beneath the soil, the casing that once held her final bullet had become mineral, then vibration, then message. Mara imagined it pulsing now with the rhythm of the world's gratitude. She spoke aloud, though she knew there was no need for sound. "You kept the promise. We're still listening." The air cooled, the hum settling into her bones. "You are the promise," the unseen voice replied. "Keep breathing." And then, for the first time since the war that birthed silence, the planet laughed. It wasn't thunder or quake. It was warmth rising through everything alive, a deep joy that shook leaves and lungs alike. The sound rolled across mountains, through oceans, across the ruins of towers, until even the stars seemed to shimmer in rhythm. People woke to it and wept without knowing why. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. The earth had finally answered back, and the answer was yes. When dawn broke, the tremor ceased, leaving behind a quiet so complete that birds hesitated before singing. Then, slowly, one sparrow tried a note. The city joined with gentle sounds, footsteps, whispers, laughter that no longer needed volume. The balance held. Mara wrote the last line in her sandpaper journal. "The world no longer listens for Night Fox. It listens like her." She closed the book, placed it on the windowsill beside the bowl of water, and waited for the ripples that always came when dawn touched gratitude. 3 waves, slow and deliberate, crossed the surface. Somewhere, far beneath her, the heart of the earth pulsed once more, steady, content, alive. They were the first generation born into a world that had never known a command shouted in anger. The children of the stillness moved differently. Their eyes lingered longer on things. Their words carried careful weight. They were raised on stories that did not celebrate victory, but precision. And in their small schools, teachers spoke of an age before silence, as if describing a fever that had finally broken. No one called them prodigies, though some said they were closer to the Earth's original language. When they slept, sensors detected faint, harmonic patterns in their breathing, identical to the pulse once recorded beneath Meridian's river. Doctors stopped calling it anomaly. They began calling it inheritance. Every dawn before lessons, the children practiced alignment. They sat in circles on the ground, palms open to the sky, breathing in sync until the floor beneath them hummed. They did not pray. They listened. The air in those rooms grew warm, like the desert at first light. Some said the hum came from the planet. Others said it came from memory. It made no difference. Both were true. Mara Leon often visited those classes. Her hair had turned the color of ash, but her presence carried the same gravity as the old desert wind. She would stand among them and watch as the younger ones placed small stones on their laps, tokens of attention. When a stone trembled from breath alone, she smiled. "The world still hears you," she'd say, voice soft enough to let the silence stay whole. Her own grandchildren studied under a teacher named Alan, a boy she remembered as the 10-year-old who had first asked whether they could talk to Reyes. He was grown now, tall and quiet, his manner more question than statement. When the tremor came each 33rd second, he paused mid-sentence, letting it pass through him before continuing. He called it punctuation. The children called it proof. One morning, during alignment, A different vibration rolled beneath the floor, a rhythm not recorded before. It was faster, lighter, curious. The children looked to Alan, eyes wide. He placed his hand on the wall and listened. A smile crept over his face. "It's not the earth this time," he said. "It's us." The sound grew until the entire building seemed to purr. Across the city, similar reports came in, children laughing, their voices harmonizing with the pulse instead of covering it. The world had decided to return its echo not as warning, but as play. Mara Lian stood on her balcony watching the streets fill with the small, careful chaos of joy. For the first time since the stillness began, the sound of laughter did not startle anyone. It folded into the rhythm like sunlight into water. Later that night, she wrote in her journal, "Silence was never meant to erase sound. It was meant to teach sound how to care for itself." The children proved her right. They began creating what they called resonance gardens, open fields planted not for food, but for vibration. At dawn, they placed instruments of wood and glass in the soil, chimes, bowls, threads strung between stones. When the planet's hum arrived, the instruments answered in subtle tones, shaping harmony without conductor. People from every trade began to visit these gardens. Soldiers came to learn patience, scientists came to measure beauty, poets came to admit they were late to understanding. In one such garden at the edge of the old desert, a girl named Sarah discovered something extraordinary. She was tracing patterns in the sand when the grains began to shift on their own, aligning into spirals that pulsed faintly with light. Her classmates gasped, but she didn't stop. She placed her palm flat, the same way Reyes once had. The sand responded by rising slightly, forming an outline of a hand larger than her own, steady, familiar. Alan knelt beside her. "What do you hear?" Sarah's eyes glistened. "A woman saying thank you." The story traveled fast but without spectacle. It was not news. It was recognition. The world had decided to introduce its history to its future. From that day, when children practiced alignment, they left a space open in their circles. Some said it was for Reyes. Others said it was for whatever needed to return next. By the time Mara Lian passed away, her journals filled an entire wall. The last entry read simply, "They listened long enough to become the sound itself." Her funeral was silent, but not sad. The city paused its heartbeat for exactly one tremor, then resumed softer. A gentle wind lifted a strand of her hair into the air and carried it toward the river, where it dissolved into shimmer. Years folded gently. The children grew, building communities that balanced motion and rest. They invented no new weapons. They learned to shape energy through resonance instead. Machines built on rhythm replaced those built on combustion. Transportation moved on air pressure that imitated breath. Medicine tuned itself to the body's internal cadence. Every new structure incorporated silence as material, walls that absorbed cruelty, floors that echoed empathy. No parliament met without a moment of alignment before debate. No sentence was passed without the hum's confirmation. The earth remained patient, steady, a heartbeat that needed no applause. Sometimes when storms approached, old veterans of the noise age gathered at the edge of the sea. They stood barefoot in the shallows, remembering both thunder and laughter, unsure which had taught them more. They felt the vibration climb through their legs and into their chests. None spoke. There was nothing left to prove. On the anniversary of the first stillness, children around the world released small vessels into rivers and seas. Tiny cups filled with sand and brass casings melted into smooth orbs. Each one carried a single word etched on its side: listen. When the tide carried them away, the oceans began to hum softly, adopting the rhythm of a lullaby too vast for origin. That night, as the stars gathered like observers of their own creation, an aurora spread across both hemispheres. It wasn't light in the usual sense, it was vibration made visible. threads of resonance weaving through sky and sea. Scientists measured, poets wept, children slept without fear. In the calm between pulses, the world seemed to speak again. Its voice was everywhere and nowhere low enough to be mistaken for thought. "You have learned to aim your quiet," it said. "Now teach your joy to listen too." And for the first time since history began recording itself, humanity understood that silence was never the opposite of sound. It was its teacher, its refuge, its reflection. The children of the stillness lifted their faces to the sky, listening. The hum answered with a note that felt like laughter. The next morning, the Council of Echoes announced a single decree, the first in many years. From this day, noise shall mean indifference. It was not punishment, but boundary. Those who chose disregard were left outside the hum's protection, not exiled, simply unheard. Most returned quickly, reminded that isolation was louder than silence. Decades folded like gentle waves. Children were born who could feel tremors across continents, who laughed in tones that calmed storms. The phrase "language barrier" disappeared from dictionaries. Empathy had replaced translation. In the centennial year of the stillness, representatives from every region gathered in the valley where Kestrel once stood. Nothing remained of the base but the shape of its absence, a shallow bowl of earth filled with wind. At noon they knelt, palms on the soil. The ground answered with a pulse older than humanity, steady as forgiveness. A woman stepped forward, carrying a small glass sphere. Inside floated a single grain of the black sand that had once held Reyes's memory. She placed it at the valley's center and whispered, "We return what taught us to return." Then she stood back. The sand glowed briefly and dissolved into light that traveled outward, circling the planet once before fading into the sky. That night the tremor came again, but different, a new interval, a higher octave. The earth was not reminding this time, it was celebrating. Mountains vibrated like deep drums, oceans shimmered with harmonic foam, and the air over deserts shimmered gold. Humanity answered not with fireworks or chants, but with the quiet thrill of comprehension. They had become fluent. Somewhere beneath the valley, the frequency of the old rifle barrel sighed and rested, its purpose complete. It joined the planet's heartbeat without distinction. The age of resonance had no anthem. Its only song was the world itself, breathing evenly, endlessly. And above it all, faint but certain, lingered the last whisper of the voice that had begun everything. If you can hear this, you've already learned how to lead. Time in the age of resonance was measured not in years, but in waves. Each one the rise and fall of harmony between humanity and the world it had finally learned to hear. Generations passed as easily as breaths. Decades folded like notes in a song that no longer needed a beginning. People lived longer, not because medicine had triumphed, but because stress had forgotten how to hold their bones. The story of Night Fox, once told as history, became ritual. Children recited her lessons in rhythm rather than language. Every school began its day with a shared breath facing the horizon, an act of gratitude, not worship. The first sound, teachers whispered, was silence remembering what it wanted to say. Mara Lian's journals, preserved in crystal vaults, were read only aloud. The pages refused reproduction. Each syllable released faint vibrations that realigned the room. Scholars called this the proof of resonance, knowledge that changed the knower simply by being heard. And yet, even in harmony, curiosity persisted. A group of young historians from the southern archipelago began to wonder what the world had been like before the stillness. They called themselves the Reverb Circle. Their meetings were quiet, but their intent was not. They wanted to build the first device capable of replaying humanity. Its lost sounds, engines, arguments, thunder, unsoftened by empathy. They meant no harm. They simply believed that to understand peace fully, one must remember its opposite. They built their laboratory far from the resonance gardens, deep within cliffs where the earth's hum was faint. They worked for seasons, gathering fragments of old recordings sealed in rock and ice. When they finished, they constructed a single chamber lined with obsidian panels. Its core, a sphere of silver that could translate frequency into image. They called it the Archive of Noise. On the day of activation, the oldest of them, a woman named Sarah, the same girl who once saw a hand of sand form under her palm, touched the switch. The room filled with sound so dense it felt like pressure. Engines roared, sirens wailed, shouts collided with the metallic crash of forgotten wars. The air thickened until breathing required will. Then, through the chaos, another frequency rose, low, patient, familiar. The noise folded around it, tamed. The observers fell silent as the voice of Reyes returned, not as warning this time, but as smile. You needed to remember, it said, so you could forgive what made you. The recording slowed. Images of cities burning faded into images of hands rebuilding, of soldiers laying down rifles, of children drawing circles in sand. The walls absorbed the rest. When it was over, Sarah turned to the others. We've heard enough, she said. They dismantled the archive piece by piece and carried the components to the sea. There they released them into the water, each piece dissolving into vibration. The ocean accepted the offering and hummed brighter for it. From that day, history itself changed shape. Museums became places of quiet immersion rather than display. Visitors walked barefoot across resonant floors that replayed emotion instead of sight. You could stand on one tile and feel the weight of a century, the fear that had birthed silence, the relief that had replaced it. It was not about remembering facts anymore. It was about remembering how it felt to be deaf to each other. The Reverb Circle disbanded. Its members became teachers, healers, composers of stillness. Sarah returned to her old garden on the desert's edge and found the sand restless again, rippling in gentle spirals. She sat there until dusk and asked softly, "Are you still here?" The sand answered not with sound, but with warmth under her hands. Always, it seemed to say, because you still listen. By then, technology had become indistinguishable from empathy. Machines learned to sense hesitation, adjusting their rhythm to match their user's breath. Architecture evolved into organism, buildings exhaled carbon into forests, floors pulsed gently to guide footsteps toward calm. Even light learned discretion, brightening only when eyes welcomed it. Travel between worlds began. The first ships left Earth powered not by combustion or radiation, but by synchronized resonance with the planet's magnetic song. When they broke orbit, the Earth's pulse followed them, a tether of memory. Those who left could still hear it in their sleep, the faint throb of home, like a mother's heartbeat remembered from the womb. The age of resonance became a library of tone, and humanity its custodians. They no longer wrote constitutions, they composed chords. Councils were measured in octaves. The title leader dissolved into listener. Centuries blurred into harmony. No calendar marked them. Then one day, deep in the archives beneath Meridian, a child uncovered something unexpected, a shard of glass etched with coordinates leading back to the very spot where Kestrel Base once stood. The Council of Echoes debated for 3 pulses before agreeing to investigate. They arrived at dawn. The valley looked unchanged. The same quiet bowl of sand, the same whisper of wind. But as they stepped into its center, the ground glowed faintly, revealing concentric circles of darker earth. At the heart lay a small cavity filled with smooth black stones, arranged in perfect spiral. One of the councillors knelt and placed his ear close. A hum rose from the stones, ancient, deliberate. It carried a message only the patient could decipher. Hours passed before its meaning resolved. When memory learns kindness, history ends. The councillors stood in silence, understanding that the phrase was not command, but release. The spiral began to dissolve into dust, carried upward by the first wind of the new era. That evening, across the planet, the global hum shifted key. It climbed one octave, lightning like laughter, and every living creature paused to feel the adjustment. The Earth was teaching again, this time the lesson of continuation. People began to call it tomorrow's birth. On the 1000th wave after the stillness, the descendants of those first listeners gathered at Meridian's river. They held no flags, no emblems, only the pulse between them. The youngest among them, a girl whose eyes mirrored the horizon's color, asked the question no one had dared in centuries: what comes after listening? An elder smiled. Understanding, he said. And after that? Creation. She nodded, looked toward the rising sun, and closed her eyes. The hum deepened in response. The world inhaled. And in that breath, vast, ancient, utterly alive, humanity felt the memory of every silence that had ever saved it. Tomorrow had already begun. It started without plan or proclamation, a sound that slipped quietly from a child's throat one morning beside the river at Meridian. She had been humming along with the planet's pulse since she could form breath, but that day, something changed. The hum rose through her body and left her mouth shaped like dawn, not melody, not language, simply tone. The air around her shimmered. Birds stopped. The river slowed. People nearby turned toward the sound, not in surprise, but in recognition. They began to join. First one, then many. No lyrics, no instruments. The vibration linked heartbeat to heartbeat until the entire shoreline breathed the same note. It carried through soil into the city, and from there into the hills, across valleys, through forests, up into clouds. Within an hour, the whole hemisphere resonated. The hum that had once belonged to the earth now wore a human accent. The first chroniclers called it the convergence. Later, poets named it the moment the world sang back. But the people who lived it simply said, we remembered ourselves. Everywhere, sound replaced command. Construction crews worked by chord, finding the pitch that coaxed stone to fit. Farmers sang at dawn to draw sap upward. Midwives used low tones to ease childbirth, their voices echoing through corridors like heartbeat made audible. The act of creation became inseparable from the act of harmony. The new art that rose from this was neither song nor speech. It was called choral language, an exchange in which tone carried meaning and emotion simultaneously. Each phrase held intention as vibration. When two people disagreed, their voices wove counter-melodies until both sides resonated into a single equilibrium. Arguments still happened, but they sounded like symphonies instead of battles. Technology adapted to match. Instruments once built for amplification were redesigned for translation. Glass towers became tuning forks. Streets were paved in materials that stored melody. The air above cities shimmered constantly, whispering the sum of what humanity felt. And through it all, the earth responded. Oceans pulsed in rhythm, adjusting currents to match the global key. Trees leaned toward one another, branches clicking softly like percussion. Even the wind changed timbre, a deep resonance that cradled every living thing. For the first time, music was no longer performance. It was language, medicine, memory. In the highlands of what had once been the northern desert, the descendants of the kestrel listeners built a great amphitheater carved directly into the rock. They called it the resonant field. No stage, no walls, only a perfect bowl of stone designed to collect the hum of the planet and return it softened. Here, people came not to watch, but to contribute. Anyone could step into the center and breathe. The field shaped their sound, folded it into the harmony of everything else. The first time the field filled completely, observers felt the vibration rise above hearing range. Stars overhead seemed to shimmer more brightly. Some claimed the auroras had lowered to touch the edges of the amphitheater. After that night, the phrase "singing to the sky" became literal. Travelers carried this practice outward. They sang to mountains and heard echoes that taught geology. They sang to deep sea vents and discovered rhythms that healed pressure wounds. The first interplanetary ships, guided by resonance, launched under a chorus of thousands. Their engines didn't roar. They harmonized with gravity until space itself welcomed them. And through the quiet between stars, they heard another hum. Faint, distant, yet undeniably familiar. Others are listening too. The realization changed everything. Humanity understood that listening was not the end of evolution. It was the invitation to join a larger choir. Every living world, perhaps every star, held its own tone, waiting for harmony. Back on Earth, the great libraries transformed again. Shelves gave way to chambers where sonic maps recorded the voice of every place that had ever been alive. You could walk through and feel the difference between the tone of ocean salt and mountain snow. Scholars no longer studied history by dates, but by resonance signatures. The age of noise, the stillness, the resonance, the singularity of breath. The elders who still remembered Mara Leon's journals said that this, finally, was the prophecy she never wrote. The moment when silence stopped being an absence and became an instrument. In the century following the convergence, humanity's anthem consisted of 3 notes: the low hum of earth, the mid-tone of human heartbeats, and a high, almost invisible frequency recorded far beyond the atmosphere, the echo of the ships singing their way through space. When played together, the 3 notes formed a chord scientists named continuum. It had no dissonance. One evening, a group of children gathered in the resonant field and asked a question that no adult could answer. If we all sing now, who listens? An old caretaker smiled. Perhaps listening never stopped. Perhaps the stars have always been ears. They laughed, and in their laughter the field trembled like joy caught in stone. For a heartbeat, the tone of the world shifted. A 4th note joining the chord, brief but unmistakable. Later, instruments confirmed it had come from beneath the ground, from the deep resonance of the planet's core. The Earth, it seemed, had learned harmony too, and when the sound faded, a whisper lingered softer than memory but bright as sunrise. The silence was never mine alone. It was waiting for you to find your voice. The children understood without words. They began to hum again, not for ritual but for play, weaving small harmonies that rolled through the valley like water through reeds. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the stars shifted color. A reply, perhaps. Humanity kept singing, the planet listened, and the universe, vast, patient, filled with its own quiet possibilities, leaned closer. At last, the songs of Earth reached beyond their own blue horizon, not as broadcast, not as conquest, but as breath, expanding into the dark between stars with the humility of prayer and the confidence of truth. For centuries, the hum had wrapped the planet like atmosphere. Now, it leaked deliberately outward, searching for others who could answer. The first reply came not through machines, but through tide. Oceans began to rise and fall in patterns that no moon commanded. The rhythm matched the ancient cosmic background. A whisper left by the birth of everything. Astronomers, listening through vast telescopes tuned to sound instead of light, recorded the pulse. It carried intervals identical to the ones once formed in the resonant field. It meant only one thing. The universe had always been singing. Earth had only just learned the key. The Council of Echoes gathered for the last time on the valley floor, where Kestrel had disappeared into legend. No walls, no microphones, only stone that remembered. They sat in a ring, each delegate carrying a sphere of tone, distilled from their homeland: desert wind, mountain rain, forest dawn, city heartbeat. When they placed the spheres together, the frequencies aligned until the air itself turned visible, light, trembling with sound. The chair of the council, an elder descended from the first children of stillness, spoke softly. "We have spent ages learning to hear one another. Now we must listen wider." They began to hum. The chord grew, folding continents into a single vibration that crossed the ionosphere and slipped into the void like a tide meeting deeper tide. Satellites stopped transmitting data and started translating harmony. For the first time since their launch, the ships beyond orbit answered, not in words, but in returning tone. Each vessel sang what it had found. One echoed the resonance of icy moons, another the bass heartbeat of gas giants, another a crystalline choir rising from light years away. The sounds converged until the heavens themselves became an orchestra of gravity and color. Humanity had joined a language that needed no species. From the far side of the galaxy came the oldest voice, slow, deep, amused. It vibrated through everything alive. Welcome, small listener. We wondered when you would remember the melody. People across the world felt it simultaneously, in bones, in rivers, in the hush before sunrise. Some fell to their knees, others laughed, most simply breathed. They understood that creation was never silent. It had only been waiting for ears kind enough to comprehend. The earth replied. Its core released a note so low it could move mountains without cracking them. The oceans added harmony. Forests swayed in sync. Clouds refracted sunlight into prisms that pulsed like rhythm made visible. The entire biosphere became instrument. Humanity did not conduct. It listened, adjusting its tone until the universal chord included them without distortion. When the alignment was perfect, sound turned to light, the aurora expanding outward until night became transparent. From orbit, it looked as though the planet had opened its lungs. In that luminous equilibrium, memories returned, not personal, not national, but planetary. The laughter of those who had doubted, the prayers of those who had listened, the steady breath of a woman once known as Reyes, Night Fox, Echo, Silence. Her frequency threaded through the chorus, unchanged. Aim with care, it murmured through every tone. Listen before you act. Leave the world tuned when you go. Then her note dissolved into the greater harmony, indistinguishable from starlight. The choir of the universe continued to build. Worlds answered, a moon of methane singing in subharmonics, a ring of dust shimmering like bells, distant civilizations whose songs described colors unknown to human eyes. There was no translation, only resonance, meaning carried by empathy instead of syntax. Centuries passed inside that single, endless chord. Space exploration became pilgrimage. Voyagers traveled not to conquer, but to collaborate, bringing Earth's hum to places that had forgotten theirs. Where silence had become despair, music returned. Where noise had become cruelty, balance followed. Each planet learned anew that listening was the beginning of creation. Back on Earth, the resonant field lay quiet again, its stone bowl filled with sky. No ceremonies marked its anniversaries. Only the wind visited, and when it passed, it left behind the faintest whisper of a melody that could never fully fade. Children still came sometimes to sit at its center. They placed their palms on the stone and felt the pulse that connected them to everything. One boy once asked his mother, "Is this where the first song started?" She smiled. "Here, or somewhere just like it. Maybe it's still starting." He listened for a long time before answering, "I think it never stopped." And she realized he was right, because in the deep fabric of existence, beyond galaxies, beyond even time, the resonance continued, the hum of consciousness recognizing itself, a song written not in notes, but in kindness. The choir of the universe swelled and softened, carrying forward the lesson that had begun with a single quiet heartbeat in a desert long forgotten. Silence was never the absence of sound. It was the universe learning to sing, and somewhere in that eternal harmony, the echo of Night Fox smiled and kept listening.